Okay, let's go ahead and go through these last couple of slides with weighted average cost of capital, and then we'll do a couple of problems, just a couple. We'll finish this chapter up next time, but we'll talk about the weighted average cost of capital project because you guys are starting to have some good questions, and depending on what you're planning on doing, you may want to have some conversations at work. So we just saw how to calculate the cost of equity. You can use the dividend discount model, which doesn't work very often. Use CAPM, which most companies use. And then next time we'll talk about the Fama-French model, which is a third alternative. So cost of equity has some options. Cost of debt doesn't. It's exactly what we did in Chapter 9, I believe. It is, we look at the expected coupon payments through time. We look at that $1,000 we get back at the end of the life of the bond, and we calculate the yield to maturity. The only thing with the cost of debt, we talked about it a little bit previously, but the beauty of cost of debt is the interest is tax deductible. So most frequently when you cite your cost of debt, you talk about your after-tax cost of debt. So you do the calculation to get the yield to maturity, and then you multiply it by 1 minus the tax rate to get to the after-tax cost of debt. Most companies, that's all they have is debt and equity. But there are some companies that have a small amount of preferred stock. I don't think I've ever seen a company that has more than 10% preferred stock, but you'll occasionally run into companies with some preferred stock. If they have it, remember with preferred stock, there's no growth in their dividend. The way we calculate the return on preferred stock is it's just dividend yield. It's the amount of interest that they pay each year divided by the present value or the cost of the stock. So it's a dividend yield. We put all of this together to come into the weighted average cost of capital, and it truly is a weight. So we look at the percentage of equity financing we use times the cost of equity. We get the cost of equity typically by CAPM. We look at the percentage of debt financing we use times the yield to maturity or the cost of debt times 1 minus the tax rate. So it's an after-tax cost of debt. If we had preferred stock, we'd look at preferred stock relative to the total investment we have in assets times the cost of preferred. This book doesn't even put it in the formula anymore because preferred stock is so infrequently used. That's the formula, and don't let this confuse you. A little bit. This is stock plus bond, and this is required return on stock. So it's the same as this formula. The book just uses the simplification of S&B. This book is probably the only place I've ever seen that, but they do. You typically just see equity and debt, but if you see that formula, know that that's what they're talking about. All right, so let's see how we put this thing to use. We use this routinely when we're trying to figure out the value of a firm. And what is the value of a firm? It's the present value of all of the cash flows they're going to earn. And the cash flows we calculate by projecting out and discounting them back to today. We discount them at the weighted average cost of capital. Up until now, we've called it the interest rate or required rate of return, but it is the weighted average cost of capital. And if we want to see what the value of the company is, then we would calculate the equity value and the debt value to find out the enterprise value. And they do an example in the book with the International Paper Company, and you calculate your cost of debt and your cost of equity, and in order to come up with the overall firm's cost of capital. And this one's a little bit simplistic, but they say the average beta is 0.82, less risky than the market. Paper company, probably not unrealistic. They calculated a risk-free rate of 2% and a market risk premium of 7%. And so given that information, they used the CAPM to calculate the cost of equity. And when that calculation was made, they came up with a cost of equity of about 7.744%. If they tell us that the debt is, the company's debt has a 5% required return and a 35% tax rate, we don't even have to calculate the yield to maturity in this one because they already did it for us. The only thing we need to do is figure out the after-tax cost of debt. And they've told us that the company is 32% debt financed. We haven't heard anything about preferred stock, so we can assume if they're 32% debt financed, the rest of it, or 68% of the company, is equity financed. So to use the CAPM, we'd say the company is 68% equity financed times a cost of equity of 7.74% plus 32% debt financed times a cost of debt of 5% times 1 minus the tax rate to get to the weighted average cost of capital. And that would be, as we were looking for international paper, if they were looking to acquire another company that had similar risk, we would forecast their cash flows, and then we discount them all back at that 6.3%. So you now know everything there is to know about finance. This is sort of the summation of everything. You figured out how to do cash flows in Chapter 6, and now you know how to come up with that discount rate. This is sort of the summation of finance. And it is also why when somebody brings you an analysis, you have got to question it, because there's assumptions in absolutely everything. The percentages of debt and equity finance are pretty good. But man, look at all the assumptions that went into our cost of equity. What's the risk-free rate? What's the beta? What time period did you use to calculate the beta? What did you use for required return on market? Now, your cost of debt's pretty straightforward. Your tax rate is pretty straightforward, although companies, especially now when we're getting these tax credits, the tax rates are off a little bit. But the big thing and the highest cost in a weighted average cost of capital is typically this cost of equity, and there are just an extraordinary number of assumptions that go into that calculation. So it doesn't matter who brings you an analysis where they're telling you the company should move in a particular direction. The most important thing I think that you get out of this class is finance is really important, but there are so many assumptions. The best thing you can learn to do in finance is question all of the assumptions and understand where they came from and see if it intuitively makes sense to you. And we're going to do some of those big problems before the semester ends. Anita, what question do you have?
In this formula right here, what are the calculations for the 68% and the 7.74%?
Okay, so this 68% is based on this right here, that we're 32% debt financed. So you're either going to be debt financed or equity financed. If you're 32% debt financed, the rest, or 68%, is equity financed.
It's 1 minus.
It's 1 minus, yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay, now that's not true if you have preferred stock too. So if you were 32% debt financed and they had 10% preferred stock, then the rest of it, or 58%, would be debt financed. Okay, I'm sorry, would be equity financed. So let me say that again. If you were 32% debt financed and 10% preferred stock finance, that would represent 42% financing. The rest of it, or 58%, would be equity financed. Most companies only have debt or equity. If they have preferred, then you have to take all three into consideration when you're calculating the percentage of financing. Does that make sense, Anita?
Yes, but I'm sorry, where was the 7.74?
Right here. We calculated that.
Going to it. Okay.
Yep, we just calculated that a minute ago. So that was using CAPM. We did that calculation. Okay. Now, what I want you to do is a couple of problems where you're actually doing the calculations. I'm going to put you back in your rooms to do problem 1 and 2 together. Problem 1 is a weighted average cost of capital. It's pretty straightforward. It's a straightforward CAPM. Just remember the difference between return on the market and market premium. And problem 2 is a bond calculation. And so that's hearkening back a couple of chapters, but hopefully that won't be too terribly complex. I'll give you, well, you know what? When you're done, come on back in the room. And so I'll check on you in a few minutes, but do both problems 1 and 2, and I'm going to try not to rush you. So take your time, but come on back in here so I'll know when people start to finish up.